Hello, welcome to Stakeholder-Specific Vulnerability Categorization Analysis Training. My name is Stephanie Kennelly. I'm a Vulnerability Analyst at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, with my primary duties involving scoring using SSVC, as well as performing general vulnerability analysis. I, along with Jonathan Spring, a member of the Threat Directorate at the CERT Coordination Center, and one of the founding authors of SSVC, will be walking through how to score using SSV using various decision trees. Going through the agenda for this training, first, we will go over goals and expected outcomes we expect trainees to achieve after completing the training. We will then transition to explaining who this course is meant for, what an analyst needs in order to utilize SSVC, and how to score using SSVC. Lastly, we will go over examples for each SSVC methodology to help test your skills with different decision trees. In summary, SSVC improves vulnerability management processes and accounts for diverse stakeholders by providing 3 different decision tree models to accommodate various needs and abilities. Looking to improve its own vulnerability analysis methodology, SSVC worked with the CERT-CC to customize its own decision tree designed to help its stakeholders make the best cybersecurity decisions. SSVC has used SSVC since April 2020 and has had positive results. After completing this course, you should be able to analyze a vulnerability using SSVC by collecting evidence for the agreed upon decision points for your role in order to triage the vulnerability.
Thanks, Stephanie. So in order for our students to get the best outcomes out of this course, they should already know a few things. Should know some of the basics about cybersecurity vulnerabilities, what they are, how they get managed. Should know a little bit about information security in general, and we're going to assume some understanding of general information technology operations. I'll give a little bit more detail on what we're expecting you to already know on the next 3 slides to expand these things out a little bit. So for this course, what we mean by vulnerability is here on this slide. This is from the Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure Guide. Vulnerability is a set of conditions or behaviors even, right, that allow the violation of some security policy. It doesn't matter if that security policy is explicit or implicit. Right, all that matters is that the vulnerability is a set of behaviors or conditions that allows the violation of it. So there are some other concepts that you should already be familiar with before starting this training. For example, you should know what a common vulnerability enumeration identifier is, a CVE ID. You should understand some of the basics about patch management, how to apply patches, how to do change management for your organization. Right? We're not going to teach you how to apply patches or create patches here in this course. The NIST Special Publication 840 has a reasonably good summary of patch management stuff. Some vulnerabilities are caused by flaws in software, and some of them are misconfigurations. Right? So we won't specifically say misconfiguration here again, but we should understand, and everyone taking the course should understand, that SSVC applies to prioritizing misconfigurations as well as applying patches. So we assume that you know enough about misconfiguration and configuration management to make those sorts of changes should they be needed. As far as general information security, the assumption here is that you know enough about how the system works and how to protect it, that we're not going to step you through what a firewall does, what an access control list is for, like how you make a security policy. Right? We're going to assume that you know some of those things. We also assume that you basically know enough about digital forensics, whether it's on a system, an individual system, memory, whatever, or network forensics to gather evidence for the things that you might need, whether it's through scanning or IDS logs or whatever. The general sort of structure of sort of security involving, protecting things, preparing for doing so, detecting stuff that's wrong, responding to incidents. Right, we're not going to teach any of that. We're very narrowly focused with SSVC on vulnerability management and specifically like triage of vulnerabilities as you get them in. In order to understand a vulnerability and to gather information about it, we expect you to be conversant with sort of general IT operations in that you know what a routing table is, you know what an operating system is, you know what a database is, right? Because if there's a vulnerability in a database, in order to understand a little bit about how bad that is, you need to at least understand what a database is, what it's used for, what can go wrong with it. So we won't be explaining email protocols or operating systems or Active Directory or any of these other sorts of applications that you might find vulnerabilities in. We're going to sort of assume some background knowledge in that. And there's lots of resources where you can learn how to get information out of those systems, what they're used for, that sort of a thing, but we won't be covering that here today.
This course will teach how to do vulnerability analysis with SSVC. This course will not teach risk owners how to set up risk tolerance. Leadership needs a broader view than this course will provide. And leadership also needs to set a risk tolerance before analysts can evaluate vulnerabilities against that risk tolerance. In SSVC, risk tolerance is defined by a decision tree. This course uses example trees from the SSVC version 2 publication, and this is the operational triage tree. The SISA tree is an example of a coordinator tree, so therefore the specific coordinator trees defined in the SSVC version 2 publication will not be taught during this course. An organization can have different groups performing different roles, and they can perform the different roles at different times. For example, if an organization develops software and manages IT operations, depending on the role, an analyst could either utilize the supplier tree for software development or the coordinator tree for IT operations. When discussing different roles at different times, such as a supplier pushing a web browser update, the developer may deploy updates to the TLS library made by other suppliers. Since software libraries are common, the developers often alternate between supplier and developers. This course is best suited for vulnerability analysts from any stakeholder type, which would be supplier, deployer, and coordinator. If you are unsure what type you are, this course or the online SSVC materials may help you better understand your role. Additionally, a benefit of SSVC is its customization abilities, and you may have a hybrid role that would benefit from its own unique tree.
So in order to best move forward with the examples we're going to present in this course, there are some things that you would already want to have handy that we're not going to prepare today with you, right? So you need the tree, the risk tolerance that your organization has sort of agreed to. If you're not sure where to start, the SSVC publications have some suggested defaults for what you can start with. You need to understand your area of responsibility and sort of what you're analyzing and what the scope is. That means you need to understand enough about your environment that you can learn about it, even though obviously you won't know everything about your environment from the start. We're going to give, as examples, vulnerabilities to analyze. What this means is we're assuming you have a way to get in vulnerabilities to try to prioritize which ones you actually are going to work on. If you don't have a list of vulnerabilities to prioritize, then SSVC won't be helpful because it doesn't tell you how to get that list in the first place. Of course, you can use the National Vulnerability Database to get a list of what the new vulnerabilities are today and look at that, or things like this, or rely on your vendors for their alerts or notices. There's lots of different ways to get a list of vulnerabilities in, but we're going to leave that aside for now. There are also various handouts that you might want to have, materials. So there's the various PDFs or other documents that are available online. SSVC has a GitHub page where you can go to raise issues if you're confused about something or find something that's wrong. We're very happy for people to do that if they find something that doesn't make sense. And there also is a demonstration calculator available that will help you step through the decisions and sort of make some of the calculations for you. when we say you're going to make a decision, what is it that actually that means? Right, so a decision in vulnerability management, to some extent, is to work on something instead of working on something else. Right? So you prioritize, you triage, right? SSVC is specifically aimed at helping you do triage of vulnerabilities when you have more than you can work on. If you can work on addressing all of the vulnerabilities that you know about, you don't need to prioritize them, so you don't need to do this. Sometimes, even when you know what task you should work on next, like what vulnerability is most important to address first, it's not obvious what you should do about it. This might be because there's not a patch available yet, or it might be because your available patch has some other costs and it's not clear whether they're worth it. In that case, SSVC might provide some questions or insights as to help you decide between those things if you are trying to understand how different changes might affect the priority that you would continue to respond. But in general, SSVC is not designed to help you decide on a course of action. It's just designed to help you understand which thing you need to work on first.
So the first tree we're going to summarize is the CISA SSVC tree. Here on the screen, there are 4 overall decisions used in this tree. The first is track, which the vulnerability does not require attention outside of CISA at this time. Continue to track the situation and reassess the severity of vulnerability if necessary. The next decision is track asterisk. Track the situation closely. The vulnerability does not require attention outside of CISA at this time. Attend is the next decision. The vulnerability requires attention by people outside of CISA's cybersecurity division. The action is a request to others for assistance, information, details, as well as potential publication about the issue. And the most severe decision in this model is act. The vulnerability requires immediate attention by CSD leadership. The action is a request to others for assistance, information, details, potential publication about the issue, and may involve an internal high-priority meeting among relevant supervisors to determine CISA's overall response.
If your role is a supplier or a deployer, you have some more general decisions to make because we don't have something so specific for you. We might recommend to the CISO sort of types that they make these more specific to what actually needs to happen. But in general, from all of the CISOs that we've talked to, these are the basic categories, right? You don't worry about it right now. You do it at sort of the scheduled amount of time, where it means change the firewall rules to apply the mitigation, or it means apply the patches or whatever. You do it out of cycle, right? So you do it faster than the regular schedule because something is important, right? Which means you might be paying people overtime. Maybe you're keeping people late on Friday, right? Because this is actually important enough to keep the regular team that does the vulnerability management stuff late to get them to work overtime, right? Then the most critical or highest priority action you could take is sort of like a whole of organization approach, right? Where you actually need more resources than the regular team has if working out of cycle. This might also include that you're going to pause regular operations. With most IT shops, regular businesses, I don't expect this level of response to happen very often. This is the sort of thing where you might expect an immediate response if there's going to be a threat to the continued organization's existence, or someone might get irreversibly hurt or even killed. So hopefully we don't have a lot of computer systems that can cause those sort of problems, but if we do, SSVC makes space for that kind of intense reaction. The way we get to a decision in SSVC is by a logical combination of just some answers to some questions. So for example, we might decide that in this situation where the state of exploitation is that there's a public proof of concept, and also the utility of the vulnerability to the adversary is pretty low. It's laborious for them to make efforts with it. It's hard for them to make progress, right? And also these other things, right? So if proof of concept and laborious and total and minor, then what we've decided ahead of time is that we will act according to the schedule. And so what we will do with SSVC as an analyst is your role is going to be to figure out, say, whether exploitation is none or public proof of concept or active. And then you will also then have to decide whether the technical impact is partial or total. And then once you know the answers to those 4 questions, the pre-agreed sort of logical structure tells you to act in a scheduled way, or whatever the answer happens to be.
The analyst collects evidence for the relevant decision points pertain to a specific SSVC model. In the previous example, these were state of exploitation, automatable, value density, technical impact, and public safety impact. Once the analyst answers the questions, the logic defined by the tree determines the triage priority decision. So taking a look at the SZA SSVC model, the decisions of track asterisk, attend, and act are based on the following decision points. Breakdowns of each decision point are viewable in the SZA SSVC handout on the SZA SSVC webpage, which is provided below in the video description. So outcomes are based on exploitation evidence, none, public proof of concept, or active. Is the vulnerability being actively exploited by known actors? Is there publicly available proof of concept, or are there neither of those options? Automatable. Is the vulnerability wormable in an environment? If so, automatable would be yes. If not, it means there are barriers in place that an attacker would need to overcome, such as ASLR, user interaction, privileges required, local or physical access to the network. Technical impact, partial or total. When an attacker exploits this vulnerability, would they have complete control over that affected product, such as remote code execution, privilege escalation, or total information disclosure, or exposed credentials? Or would they only have partial impact? So is it only a denial of service? Is it partial information disclosure? Mission prevalence. This category looks at the number of the affected product in the environment you're analyzing, but it also takes into account the importance of that functionality of the product in the environment. So essential. Is this product super prevalent in your environment, and does it also, or does it provide important functionality? Support. Does it provide a medium equivalent level of functionality, or does it have a medium level of prevalence in your organization? And minimal, it does not reach the functionality or number of either of the other 2 categories. Lastly, public well-being. This takes a look at the financial, social, economic, psychological impacts exploitation of a vulnerability would have on your environment. Are the impacts irreversible, such as vulnerabilities in vehicles where an attacker could cause an accident? Is the damage material? Are you losing do you experience financial loss? Are your customers' personal information being exposed? Minimal. It doesn't meet either the requirements for irreversible or material. And again, you can find more examples and clear definitions in the SZA SSVC handout. Mission prevalence and public well-being cross-intersect for a low, medium, high rating. And then that is how you use these decisions in this decision tree for the SZA model. And as you can see, vulnerabilities rate more critically when a public proof of concept or active exploitation are known. different roles can use different decision points. That is, they use different information. As shown in the table, these 5 decision points are utilized in the SSVC SSVC decision tree.
There are related ones that a supplier would use. So you can see that the supplier and the coordinator both might use the technical impact information item. Different stakeholders have different information, so we don't want to ask an analyst at a supplier to know what the exposure of an information system is, because they're just not going to know. So it's important that the information for each stakeholder is information that they actually have. So for example, a deployer knows a lot more about how the system is actually deployed, and so the information that we expect them to have reflects that. Some of these are shared across many roles. So the state of exploitation, whether the vulnerability is automatable or not. Those shared information items are good targets for shared communication. They make sense to put in vulnerability notes, because everyone might need to know them, so if one person knows them, they should tell everyone else. Some of the decision points, on the other hand, are unique. As I mentioned, the deployer is the only one that really knows the exposure of the system that they're using. So we won't ask anyone else to know that. The deployer also is the only one who knows specifically the mission impact of the system to their mission, whether that's a for-profit company, the goal to their bottom line, or some other organization with some specifically mandated mission.
All of the SSVC decision trees evaluate impacts to safety, economic, social, emotional, and psychological factors. SSVC provides suggestive options to consider when examining how exploitation of a vulnerability may impact other areas of concern aside from the technical. The stakeholder should consider the safety impact on the system operators and users of the software they provide. However, the trees do not evaluate these impacts equally. The deployer has the most categorizations to evaluate physical safety, ranging from none, minor, to catastrophic. The SSVC tree evaluates public well-being using 3 categorizations of minimal, material, and irreversible. And supplier evaluates whether there is minimal or significant impact to public safety based on exploitation of their product.
So we're talking about examples for this course. We'll walk through 3 example vulnerabilities that are all from 2021. We'll demonstrate how you might collect answers and sort of show how, for the supplier, you might have this much more coarse access to information about public safety, whereas the deployer is going to have more information. But of course, we'll need an example deployer for that, and so on. So you'll have to apply that to your own environment or your own organization. So obviously, we're going to step through many decision points that you, in your role as your stakeholder, might not step through. We're going to try to break the examples up into one stakeholder at a time. So you might be able to navigate to the part that is best suited for you, or use the part that's best suited for you. But also you might want to get a sort of broad understanding of how all of these questions might be answered. The 3 examples that we're going to use are a remote code execution in the VMware vSphere, some vulnerabilities in some network cameras, and a vulnerability in Microsoft Defender.
Beginning here, we will go over the 3 aforementioned examples using the SSVC coordinator role. A public proof of concept is available. For awareness, we are aware that this vulnerability has been actively exploited in the wild, but for the purposes of this training, we are asking you to evaluate that information as of March 10th, 2021, prior to the known date of exploitation. The product is prevalent concerning this training environment, and a patch is available. The first decision point for the SSVC SSVC tree examines the state of exploitation. On the screen are the 3 vectors utilized for that decision point. As provided on the example slide, there is a public proof of concept available. So one of the following cases is true. Exploit code sold or traded on underground or restricted fora. Typical public POC in places such as Metasploit or ExploitDB, and the vulnerability has a well-known method of exploitation. The second category, automatable, and you have the option of yes or no for whether that vulnerability is automatable, synonymous with wormable. As provided in the example, the answer to this question would be yes. The attacker can reliably automate steps 1 to 4 of the kill chain. So the attacker was able to perform exploitation via network access, did not require any privileges prior to the exploitation, did not require user interaction, and there were no other security barriers in place preventing the vulnerability from being automatable. The next category is technical impact. Does exploitation of the vulnerability allow for partial or total control over the affected product? As the example stated, this is a remote code execution vulnerability, so the answer here would be yes, it's total. The exploit gives the adversary total control over the behavior of the software, or it gives total disclosure of all information on the system that contains the vulnerability. The next decision point is mission prevalence. Concerning the CISA SSVC tree, mission prevalence takes into account the prevalence of the product, but also the functionality of the product, ranging from minimal to essential. As the example slide stated, the product is prevalent in the training environment, and a description of the product was also provided to give guidance on the functionality of the product. Based on the prevalence and the functionality of the product, VMware vSphere would rate at essential. The vulnerable component directly provides capabilities that constitute at least one mission essential failure for at least one entity, and failure may, but need not, lead to overall mission failure. Lastly, public well-being impact. You're looking at the physical, environmental, financial, psychological, and physical harms that may come from exploitation of this vulnerability. And we assess that there is minimal. The effect is below the threshold for all aspects described in material. So in summary, these are the outcomes you should have gotten to from utilizing this is a SSVC model. Public proof of concept, yes, automatable, total technical impact, essential mission prevalence with a public well-being of minimal for a total of high when charted together. And then this leads you to the overall decision of attend. Exercise 2 concerns vulnerabilities in Honeywell IP cameras and recorders. There are 3 CVE-IDs associated with this entry, and it falls under ICSA 19304-02. ICSA is an Industrial Control Systems Advisory published by CISA. Vulnerabilities exist in the affected products where a specially crafted HTTP packet request could result in a denial of service. The vulnerability could be exploited by an attacker with network access to the vulnerable web interface, requiring no privileges and no user interaction. No identified presence within the training environment, and there is no known public proof of concept or active exploitation, and a patch is available. So please take time to pause and use your resources, whether it be handouts, the presentation, or other materials, to answer the decision points, and once you are done, you can unpause and we can go over those. The first decision point is state of exploitation. Again, this is none public proof of concept or active. Based on the information provided on exercise 2, there is none. There was no evidence of active exploitation, and no public proof of concept of how to exploit the vulnerability. The next decision point is automatable. Does the attacker need to perform additional actions in order to exploit the vulnerability, or is it automatable synonymous with wormable? Based on the description, the answer is yes, this vulnerability is automatable. The attacker was able to access the vulnerability through the network, and they did not require privileges or user interaction. The next decision point is technical impact. What can an attacker obtain or perform by exploiting the vulnerability? Is it limited control over the affected product or total control over the affected product? Based on the description, we would state that this would be partial. The exploit gives the adversary limited control over or information exposure about the behavior of the software that contains the vulnerability. Or the exploit gives the adversary an importantly low stochastic opportunity for total control. The example stated that exploitation would result in denial of service, meaning that the adversary would have limited control over the affected product. Mission prevalence, again, this looks at the functionality and the number of devices in the environment. The affected product are IP camera and recorders, and there was stated to be no known detected prevalence in the training environment. Based on this information, we would state that this has minimal mission prevalence. Neither support nor essential apply. The vulnerable component may be used within the entities, but is not used as a mission essential component, nor does it support enough mission essential functions. Lastly, looking at public well-being, looking at all these factors to see which impacts exploitation of this vulnerability would have. And based on the product exploitation and other factors, we would state that this would have minimal. The effect is below the threshold for all aspects described in material. In summary, you have exploitation none, automatable yes, technical impact partial, emission prevalence and public well-being both being minimal for a total of low. And this would result in the decision of track. For the last exercise, where you're looking at a vulnerability in Microsoft Defender under CVE-ID 2021-1647. A remote code execution vulnerability exists when Microsoft Defender malware protection engine does not properly scan a specially crafted file, leading to memory corruption. An attacker with local access who successfully exploits the vulnerability could execute arbitrary code. Microsoft reported active exploitation for this vulnerability. Microsoft Defender Antivirus is an anti-malware component of Microsoft Windows, and Windows is a common operating system. And there is a patch available. Please take this time to pause the video to use your resources, their handouts, the presentation slides, and other materials to help you answer these questions, and you can unpause so we can go over the results. The first decision point, state of exploitation. Is there none, a public proof of concept, or is there active exploitation? As stated in the slide, the vendor did state that they were aware of active exploitation of the vulnerability. Shared, observable, reliable evidence that the exploit is being used in the wild by real attackers. There's credible public reporting. Typically, we would consider reports directly from the vendor as credible reporting, so in this case, we would state it is active. The next decision point is automatable. Can the vulnerability be easily automated or wormable in an environment, or does the attacker need to overcome barriers in order to exploit the vulnerability? So for this exercise, no. Steps 1 through 4 of the kill chain cannot be reliably automated by the attacker for this vulnerability. As stated in the example description, an attacker does require local access, and because the attacker already would need to be on the victim network, this would not make the vulnerability automatable on its own. The next decision point is technical impact. Does the results of exploitation give an adversary limited or total control over the vulnerable component? Based on the description, this vulnerability does allow for remote code execution, so we would rate this vulnerability as having total control. The exploit gives the adversary total control over the behavior of the software, or it gives total disclosure of all information on the system that contains the vulnerability. The next decision point is mission prevalence. Is this product prevalent in the environment, and does the functionality support or provide essential functions to your mission? Based on the fact that Microsoft Defender is embedded in Windows operating system, and Windows operating system is probably the most common operating system in the world, we would rate this mission prevalence as essential. The vulnerable component directly provides capabilities that constitute at least one mission essential failure for at least one entity, and failure may, but need not, lead to overall mission failure. The last decision point, public well-being, impact, looking at the minimal material irreversible damage that could be done as a result of exploitation of the vulnerability for these specific categories. Based on the provided categories, we would state none. The effect is below the threshold for all aspects described in material and irreversible. For summary, you would have exploitation active, automatable, no, technical impact total, mission prevalence essential, and public well-being minimal for a result of high for mission and well-being, with the ultimate decision leading to act, the most critical of all of the SSVC CISA decisions.
All right, and now for this part of the training, we'll step through those 3 examples as if you are a supplier of the software. So for the first example, we have this pretty much the same information as we have for other folks. The VMware Server RCE, the CVE ID is 21972 from 2021. What the problem that's exposed by the vulnerability is that an actor with network access can basically bypass the authentication and can execute commands with root system access. This is a centralized management thing. If you're a supplier, this is sort of a key resource or a key part of your software infrastructure, so this is sort of a problem. Anyone can exploit this as long as they have access to the port. It's a little bit unclear for the supplier side how exactly that will be exposed, so we sort of have to assume that that's going to be available because this is a remote access thing. We're going to do this analysis as if we have not yet produced the patch because we're the supplier. I know that that's a little bit off for this timing, but just to make it a little bit clear, do the analysis as if it's March 2021, not today. So take a second and think through what you might answer for the different decision points for the supplier, and then we'll step through them together. So this one is pretty straightforward. State of exploitation is, as a decision point, designed to be publicly observable. We know there's a proof of concept because it's public. We said that, so there we are. There are some times where this is tricky, but in this case, the proof of concept code is published in Metasploit. It's very straightforward that this is a public POC. Is this automatable? Well, can all 4 of those steps be automated, right? We can find the servers, because that's well known. There's nothing that really stops the exploitation if the attacker has access to the port, which is well known, is generally open, right? So we're going to go with, yes, this is automatable. Is the value of this server diffuse or concentrated? Well, because I said server, it's probably concentrated, right? Anything that contains a lot of resources, that controls a lot of other resources, that's professionally administered, is generally concentrated value to the attacker. What's the technical impact of this vulnerability? Well, we know from the description that it provides remote code execution, which generally means that it gives the adversary total control over the server. We also might find that out from looking at the CVSS vector string. Perhaps we can look at the impact metrics. But the description is pretty clear in this case that it gives total control. So we pick that one. The last question for the supplier here is whether there's some sort of really obvious public safety impact. vSphere is not designed to be in some sort of specifically industrial control system environment. It's a general purpose IT virtualization stuff. I don't think we can assume that it is generally used for safety critical functions. And any person who deploys the software to, say, directly provision health services is a sort of special case and is not the intended use. So since that's not the intended use as a supplier, I think it would be reasonable to say that this is minimal. So that's all the questions that the supplier needs to answer. We walked through that pretty quickly. What result does that give? Well, if you put these into, say, the calculator or, just walk through the tree yourself, we see that, POC, super effective because that's the result of automatable and concentrated value density. Total, minimal there, means that you should do this out of cycle. Produce this patch more quickly than scheduled. For this second example, we're going to talk about the vulnerability in these internet protocol cameras, right? So internet cameras generally connect to the internet, whatever. This is a problem that provides, you can basically crash the camera if you send the right packet. So it's a denial of service condition. Can't compromise the camera and execute code on it, but you can cause it to not work. What exactly that packet is not public, so there's no public proof of concept. And as of this recording, we have no reliable reports of active exploitation. Again, this has been patched in the last 3 years, but let's pretend we're doing the analysis before we do that work as the supplier. So pause here for a second and see if you can step through the questions, the decision points in the deployer tree, and answer them for yourself before we step through them. First one, is there a public proof of concept? Well, at some point you have to say no, right? So you have to look in the regularly expected places, the known exploited vulnerabilities lists from various government sources or whatever your national CSIRT might tell you, the vendor advisories, you might look through Metasploit and ExploitDB, but if you look in all of those places and you don't find anything referencing this vulnerability, then you've done your due diligence and you can say that there's no known public exploitation or public POC. Is it automatable? Yeah. Send an HTTP packet. These cameras are connected to the internet. There's nothing to really stop that from happening. Do we really care about cameras? Are they, a rich resource with a lot of information and control and important company information on them? Or do they control the security codes and access for lots of other end stations? No. Obviously, if you can control a huge number of cameras and make a botnet, people might care about that. But whether you can make a botnet out of it or not depends on the technical impact, which we'll get to next. But in general, cameras are not high value in and of themselves, each individual one. Now, denial of service. Is that partial or total control? Well, you can deny service, which is some kind of control, but you can't say, make the camera run whatever code you want, which would be total control. So this is partial. Finally, what's the public safety impact for cameras being able to be turned off? Well, I would say that visual observation is not in itself a safety condition. Not being observed will not make someone be hurt. Sure, this could cascade into some other, sort of movie scenarios where you turn the camera off and then break into the bank vault. But in general, that's not what we're talking about here. And there's other controls for that. So we're going to say minimal. So in summary, for this Honeywell advisory. We have no known evidence of exploitation. It is automatable, but the value density is diffuse. The technical impact is partial, and we don't observe any significant public safety impact. So what does that mean? Well, if you put those values into the calculator, or you use the other materials to walk through the recommended supplier tree, you get to a result that the patch should be produced in the scheduled cycle for whatever scheduled means for Honeywell. The last example for the supplier tree is this Microsoft Defender RCE. Microsoft Defender is the antivirus product that ships with Windows. It ships with both Windows endpoints and Windows servers. Microsoft, in their advisory, has reported that this has been actively exploited. There is a patch available right now, but again, let's act as if we are the supplier, and so we haven't done that yet. Well, however we know about it, Microsoft knows about it, right? In fact, it doesn't really matter how they know about it if we trust Microsoft. They tend to be reliable. They might have some more details internally about how they determine what is or isn't reliable evidence of active exploitation. But they've told us, and I would consider that credible public reporting. So that aspect of active is satisfied, and so we should select active. Is this automatable? Well, if any one of the 4 steps in the kill chain is not automatable, then it's not automatable. We need a yes to all 4 of those things. So for this one, the attacker needs to be able to write a file to the system, a specially crafted file, but write a file nonetheless. That means they need a user account. A user account is not something that they can automatically get. That will frustrate delivery because they need user credentials to deliver the file to the vulnerable system. So no. 3 fails, the answer is no. Well, is this diffuse or concentrated? This one actually ends up being a little bit complicated because Windows Defender is a component in both Windows endpoints and Windows servers. But since Windows servers include a wide variety of servers that could be running any number of things, I'm going to say that this has to be considered concentrated because Windows Server might include actually the Active Directory server. Right? It might include the mail server. Your Outlook server, if it's running Windows Server, certainly would be a high-value target to the attacker because you get all of the email for the whole organization. So I think that we have to say that if that's what's going on, we have to treat this as if it's concentrated value to the attacker. Now, total or partial control over the device once it's exploited. Well, again, the description says remote code execution, pretty straightforward. That gives you total control over what the device is doing because you can execute whatever code you want from the attacker's comfort of their own keyboard. Now, is there public safety impact from this? Well, in general, this is a widely used thing. You might have Windows servers running some important financial systems or whatever. I don't actually know. Microsoft may or may not know. If they have some specific evidence that this is used in a situation where life or limb is directly at threat, then I think that they would be justified in choosing significant. But I think that for the general purpose of Windows, how it's described, it is not described as being suitable for a safety-critical environment in most cases. So we're going to call that minimal for right now. What answer does that get us? Well, if we have active, no to automatable, concentrated value, those will combine in utility for sort of efficiency and selecting outcomes, right? Total technical impact, but minimal public safety impact. What the SSVC documentation would recommend as a sort of reasonable default would be that that is produced out of cycle. Again, faster than usual because there's active exploitation. So for these 3 examples, we'll step through answering the questions as if we were a deployer of software. As we talked about earlier in the training, deployers have some additional information that other parties in vulnerability management may not have access to, but they also, then they don't need to use some other stuff that's more general or that is sort of redundant. So for the first example, if you're a deployer, if you're someone using vSphere, right? What do you know about it? Well, let's say that we are someone using this to deploy some sort of key service, but we know that the management interface on our virtualization server can be compromised by some specially crafted information packets sent to it on port 443, which, as a general rule, say that we have rented out or otherwise share some of our virtualization hardware with either other parts of the organization if we're a large organization, or maybe other organizations if we're a small or medium business. And so we can't easily totally restrict access to port 443 because a lot of people work from home. We need to be able to administer it remotely, whatever. Luckily, there is a patch available which makes our decision of what to do once we decide how quickly to do it pretty straightforward. And just for example's sake, let's act as if we're analyzing this vulnerability on March 10th, 2021, which is after the patch came out and after there was public proof of concepts in Metasploit, but before there were public reports of active exploitation. So pause for a second and try to go through the deployer tree yourself, and then we'll step through it together. So what evidence do we have for the state of exploitation in this analysis for this CVE ID about vSphere? Well, we have the URL discussing and describing exactly the public proof of concept and how it's in Metasploit. But if we look in all the regular places as of March 10th, 2021, the vendor advisory doesn't say there's known active exploitation. If you look at various other public threat intel sources, you would not find it there at this time. So we can't reliably confirm active. Maybe as a deployer, we have, IDS systems that we can provide monitoring for this vulnerability, that we could change this to active if we observed it on our network. But assuming we don't have that, what we have is a public proof of concept. Is attacking this vSphere vulnerability automatable? Well, do we have anything in place that will stop the adversary at any of those 4 points? The system is searchable, right? These servers are relatively straightforward. 443 is scannable. We should assume that people can find this if they know what they're looking for. The exploit is reliable. There's no human direction for the exploit. The delivery is not widely blocked because it's 443 and there's no other account or credentials that are needed. You just need to be able to access the server. And there's nothing really that you can do once that's delivered. So this is automatable. Is the value to the attacker of a vSphere server diffuse or concentrated? Well, server sort of tells you the answer, right? It is a high-value target. It runs all of the other virtualization stuff. It is an important target, so the attackers are going to be interested in getting access to it. What is the exposure in our environment of the server? Well, because in this example, we have lots of people doing remote administration, maybe different work environments, right? 443 is common and it's hard to shut it down. Maybe the server is not protected by some other VPN or something that would restrict it from access to the open internet. Let's treat this as if it's open. How important is this virtualization server to our mission as an organization, as a company, right? You have to know a little bit about what the purpose of your organization is and how those essential functions get accomplished to answer this question. But I think that we should have a general idea of that as security professionals. We have to know sort of what we're protecting. In this one, let's estimate that our mission actually includes delivery of services to constituents via this virtualized cloud infrastructure. So there might be actually a failure of one of our sort of essential functions here. It's not going to be so bad that our organization will crumble and cease to provide its actual entire mission, but it could actually really make things a lot harder if this were taken control of. Are we going to see any actual harm to humans? I think that the answer is no. We never want to say literally no impact, because it's hard to say literally nothing will happen. So we just say, minor or none, like anything below this threshold is prioritized the same. So as long as it's not so bad as major, we prioritize it the same. And so minor and none are, equivalent in SSVC, like prioritization. We keep those because we're borrowing them from another international standard, and we want to be consistent with how those things are rated in different safety industries. But for the purposes of the vulnerability, we are going to treat those the same there. So if we put all of those in to our handy calculator, it tells us that automatable and value density combine to super effective utility, right? The human impact combination of situated safety impact and mission is medium, right? And that leads to apply this patch at a scheduled pace. Our second example from the deployer perspective is vulnerabilities in Honeywell cameras. These three vulnerabilities are sort of talked about together in the ICSA 19304-02, and all of this data is current as of this recording. Right? So vulnerability exists in those products where if you send a specially crafted packet, you can cause a denial of service, you cause the camera to crash, stop recording, right? It doesn't require any special access, just a sort of packet of death sort of thing. Patch will be available for us if we choose to apply it. So in order to, at some point, say no, because most vulnerabilities are not exploited in the wild. Relatively few are. So at some point, we have to be able to reasonably say that we've looked in the right number of places, and we have enough confidence that the answer is that we don't have any evidence of active exploitation or public proof of concept. So vendor reporting, public press, say the known exploited vulnerabilities lists from different government sources or from your different national CSIRTs are good places to look for evidence of credible public reporting or evidence of exploitation that's shared by others. You also might have a detection infrastructure at your organization that if you have signatures for attempts at exploiting this, you can sort of set this yourself. If you are being attacked, let's say that we have that infrastructure, we haven't seen anything. We've looked at the various threat intelligence sources that we have available. Nothing says active. You look, again, for a proof of concept in the sort of responsible and regular places, but if you don't find one, then you're justified in saying none. Is this vulnerability automatable? Well, yeah. Web ports generally open, nothing that the camera needs besides just receiving the packet to crash, right? Those ports are open. In general, these cameras are designed to be open to the internet. We might have a situation where we know about the exposure, but we're going to handle that as a future question. So in general, I would expect an attacker to place relatively high value on this because they can sort of automate doing it. However, are the cameras important? Well, unless we have some very specific use case in our organization that these are really important. But again, that's handled under mission impact, not value to the attacker. This is about what the attacker will understand is the value to them and what makes them likely to attack things. Cameras, not super important, right? They're not security servers that determine who has access to everything in the organization. So we're going to call them diffuse. Now, I mentioned earlier about automatable and system exposure. They're a little bit related. Are these cameras open to the internet? That is sort of expected configuration, right? We might have a specially controlled environment where we've put them. And frankly, if we have a good asset management system at the organization, there might be some cameras that are more widely accessible. Maybe they're public webcams that we have in order to view, animals at the zoo, and it's intended to be for the public, right? So those are open by design, but then we have security cameras that are on a separate network and are controlled. So you might have different answers for different assets at the same organization because they're on different networks, even though they have the same vulnerability. But for this one, for right now, let's prioritize this as if it's open. That is sort of the design of this particular system. Now, is this important to the organization's mission? Well, in general, I'm going to say that just visual observation is not essential to the functioning of the organization. Even if these were some sort of security camera, there should be other overlapping controls. Right? So these will degrade maybe the physical security of some other thing which is supporting the mission essential functions. But everything will be able to continue for a while if the cameras go down. Now, this is closely related to the question of whether there's going to be any direct harm to humans because the cameras stop working. I think that while you can imagine sort of disaster scenarios where you stop watching the nuclear reactor and you don't observe something and then something bad happens, that's not the design for SSVC analysis. The design is plausible and credible cases that you have evidence for actually being the way things are going to happen. And in that case, I think we have to accept that just the cameras going out is only a sort of minor or no threat to anyone's safety. So as a deployer, we have these setups, right? No observed exploitation. It is automatable. The exposure is open, though, which means if someone does strike to do it, they probably will get into it quickly, right? So again, that will lead us to apply these patches sort of during our sort of regularly scheduled maintenance windows. For example 3, from this deployer perspective, so we run a lot of Windows machines in this organization that we're pretending to be. Microsoft Defender has this vulnerability, 2021-1647. It's a remote code execution vulnerability in the anti-malware feature in Windows. It is in Windows endpoints and in Windows servers. The Microsoft report specifically says that they're aware of active exploitation of this vulnerability. It does require local access to write the specially crafted file that triggers the vulnerability. So when the vendor report says that they're aware of active exploitation, that makes it pretty straightforward that the state of exploitation is active. Not too many questions here. Don't overthink it. The Microsoft vulnerability report is credible public reporting. I'm going to go forwards with that. Is this automatable? Well, what would stop an attacker from automating exploitation of the vulnerability? Well, can they deliver the file to the vulnerable system? No. They need a user account. So number 3 there, delivery, would fail to be automated unless they can automate getting user accounts in some other way. Let's assume for right now that we're going to say no to that. Although, of course, it is plausible that maybe there's some other way for them to chain a vulnerability into it. For now, say no. What is the value of, say, Windows Defender to the attacker? Well, if it's on both Windows endpoints and Windows servers, unless we're running a no Windows shop in this example, which I think that we should assume we are not, value here is going to be concentrated. And again, that's a mission impact thing. If there were no Windows devices in our environment, then we could safely set sort of mission impact to none, and then it would sort of zero everything out. But the value to the attacker is going to be quite high. So what's the system exposure? Again, let's assume that we have these systems protected, right? It's not that they're on some sort of air-gapped, isolated network with multiple controls, which would be small. But let's assume that in order to, say, scan my Windows endpoints, you can't just do that from the open internet. I have some access controls at the network level that restrict access to all of these devices. So what is the mission impact for this sort of generic IT deployer that we're pretending to be right now for this exercise? Well, if everyone's workstations go down, the workstations certainly support every mission essential function, and so those would be crippled. But as long as actually deploying the services or making the money or whatever, selling the goods that we're trying to sell is not directly dependent on that, then I think we can go forward with crippled. Right, so again, will anyone actually be harmed? This is a complicated one. If we were running a power plant and a Windows device was directly responsible for monitoring and control of the power systems, then we might have a specific different answer for especially that specific Windows system. So again, this can vary by asset. It doesn't have to be the same answer for every Windows system in the environment. Because we're deploying the software, we are the ones that know that. No one else can tell us that the one particular Windows machine on the 3rd floor of the one building is actually the one that runs all the payroll, and that might actually cause some people to go bankrupt if the whole payroll system is compromised and all the money is gone. But in general, let's prioritize this as if we're, again, going with sort of the general case there. So then what do we end up with? Well, although it's active exploitation, the exposure is controlled, and nothing super bad is going to happen to this machine. So we can do it in the scheduled manner. Again, how this is scheduled, there's some instructive thing here. For example 2, with the cameras, that probably requires a maintenance window where someone actually goes to the camera and updates the firmware because they don't have a great automatic update. For this one, Windows Defender can automatically be downloading new file definitions every day, and it does that without your interaction. So scheduled for Windows Defender might mean every day or two. Scheduled for cameras might mean 2 months, 3 months. So scheduled doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for every system, but it does mean that you don't need to keep people working extra time. That is the last example for the deployer role. If you have gone through the training for the 3 different roles, you probably have noticed that even for the same vulnerability on the same day with the same context, you might reach different priority triage conclusions for different roles. So let's summarize how those are similar and how they're different and talk a little bit about what leads to that and why it's sort of intentional in the design of SSVC, right? Stakeholder-specific vulnerability categorization. We take stakeholder-specific seriously, and if it were not specific to each stakeholder and they were all the same, then we wouldn't need to make them different. So for exercise 1, remember that's the vSphere vulnerability. The deployer decision is scheduled, whereas the other 2 are sort of the 3rd priority one, either attend or out of cycle. The actions are different. A coordinator needs to drive action such as making sure that everyone schedules to do the vulnerability patch, right? So it might be a high priority to make sure that everyone understands that they need to get this patch into their queue. But once it's into their queue, they don't need to keep everyone late. They can do it at the regular time on Tuesday. And there's also this thing where what the deployer is scheduling or planning to do might be a mitigation, it might be apply a patch. If there's no patch available, then the only thing they can do is some sort of mitigation as a deployer, change network access rules, maybe in an extreme case, turn the service off for a time. The supplier is the one who really can supply the fix, the remediation, the patch. So it can be a higher priority to get the supplier's work done because the deployers can't do anything sort of until it's done. For this one, we have a sort of similar breakdown where if the supplier never produces a patch, then no one will ever be able to apply it. So it's pretty rare for a verified vulnerability where a supplier should defer on it. But for a coordinator, everyone is doing the right things. People know about it. It's not super urgent. Track it. Doesn't need a whole lot more work. It's not like a big multi-vendor thing. Everything is sort of fine. So there's a different priority there where it doesn't take action from the coordinator because everything else is going to sort of happen at its own pace, and we assume that people will sort of absorb the patches on the timescale for the relatively low impact that this camera example is about. This one for the Microsoft Defender shows sort of the biggest disparity, right? This is a big deal, right? Windows is super common. If you load a file onto the machine, You can bypass all of the security and execute code. People really need to make sure that both they are applying these patches, but also that they look for past exploitation because it was known to be actively exploited. And the coordinator's role is also to sort of tell people to look for stuff that has already happened so they can maybe fix results from an incident, right? So they really need to get the word out on this. For Microsoft, it's obviously super important that the Windows Defender team gets a patch for this out of cycle, right? We're going to probably work overtime on this. But especially because the Windows boxes in the environment that we walked through as a deployer, the access was controlled so that it wasn't scannable from the open internet. We sort of asserted that they weren't critical to anyone's health and safety. For this example, apply that in a scheduled way. This is also interesting because scheduled here does mean really that Windows Defender will poll Microsoft servers and download a new virus definition, basically download an update within 24 hours. That's what scheduled will mean because the machine is taking care of it by itself. Everything there is automated. So as long as the machine hasn't already been compromised, it will sort of update itself on sort of a schedule, which is commensurate with how bad it is in that it's a day. You don't need to do anything faster. But because this is so widespread, active exploitation, a big deal, everyone needs to make sure they get on that schedule, even though the schedule doesn't mean maybe that you're going to stay late. Another thing you might decide is you might customize your deployer tree, your leadership might do this, to say that, well, we never have safety impacts from the Windows machines, but they're important to our mission. So we just actually are going to not have situated safety impact in our deployer decision at all. And in that case, a high mission impact would be more likely to lead to a faster decision. And that is one example of how you can customize SSVC to your situation and how that might make more sense for you in that context to do something a little bit different. But you're going to need sort of different. We were working with the example trees here just as a way to sort of step forward. But if these answers, sound wrong to you as a deployer, you're invited to change them and just change them consistently, across all of the vulnerability analysts. And then I think everyone wins again. So thank you, everyone, for spending your time with us to learn a bit more about SSVC. If you have questions, depending on the question, as you can see on the slides, there's different places for you to send that information.
For any questions regarding the CISA SSVC model, you can email central@cisa.gov with SSVC in the subject line.
If you have any general questions about SSVC, feel free to email info@sei.cmu.edu, or if you have a question or think you can make SSVC better, please submit an issue on GitHub, github.com/certcc SSVC. Thanks very much.
Thank you.